first thing I want to do is remove the wheel, so take off all 5 of your lug nuts with a 21mm socket. Now take the wheel off. If it's stuck on here, go ahead and put a lug nut back on so it doesn't fall off, and then use a rubber mallet and hit it from the back side. That should pop it right off. Take the lug nut off now that the wheel is free. Go ahead and wiggle it off of here. All right, take the wheel off. Next, I want to crack open the line, the banjo bolt that holds down the line while the caliper is still mounted. I'm going to use a 14mm socket, and this is going to help us remove it later once the caliper is not mounted. Snug it up so that fluid doesn't leak all over the place, but don't make it extra tight. Use an 18mm socket and remove the 2 caliper bracket bolts that hold this onto the knuckle. I'm going to remove the whole assembly at once, it'll be easier that way. Leave this in a few threads so that it holds the caliper while you take off the top one. Remove both of them, and then I'm going to set the caliper up on top of the upper control arm so that it's secure and it's not hanging by the brake hose. On the new caliper, we'll have to separate the caliper from the bracket, and this one's a 14mm for these bolts. It's easier if you have an impact of some sort. Let's work on the bracket for now, so set the caliper part aside. What I want to do is put grease on this area where the anti-rattle clips sit. I want to prevent this from rusting, and if it does rust, that means it's swelling and it'll actually squeeze the pads in between the 2 sides as it rusts. So it's important to put some grease in here before the anti-rattle clips actually go on. And now that this is greased up, let's take one of the anti-rattle clips. They're both the same, so it doesn't matter which one you use where. Make sure you put it on the right way. Clip it down, and it has these little tabs in the center here. Those have to squish down all the way. That's how it locks in. Now let's do the same to the other side. And you don't want to put too much grease, because if you do, it'll actually squeeze out onto the rotor when you put the anti-rattle clips on. And then you have grease on your rotor, and that's not good. Slide this on, press it down all the way. Press this one down all the way too. And now what I want to do is just add a little bit of grease to these slider pins here. Now they are already greased up, but as you can see, it's not a lot. And what I like to do is add some to the inside of the boot, and this will act as a reserve of grease for when this wears out. I'm going to put a little bit onto the slider pins as well. I know there are 2 different types of grease, but they'll be okay. And then you want to make sure that grease gets up into this ridge here at the top, which it will because it's on the boot. Press the boot in, squeeze out any excess grease that might be in there, as well as air. Sometimes air gets trapped in as you try to push this in. So get that out. Perfect. And of course, do the same to this side over here. Slide the slider pin in, squeeze the boot, remove excess grease and air. Looks like this one has some extra air in there. Now we're ready to install the bracket onto the vehicle. Take your new bracket, slide it over, and line it up with the 2 bolt holes, and start in the bolts. Now if you're going to put anything on these, do not use grease or anti-seize, use thread locker. Tighten these up and then torque them to 136 foot-pounds. It's time to put the pads in. I have the outer pad here that already fell out of the old caliper, so I'm going to slide this one in first. Now I'll show you how to get this one out. It's pretty easy. Slide it forward and it comes up and out through the middle. And to put it in, you just angle it, slide it in, and press it on. Should go on nice and easily. Take your new caliper, and before you put it on, I like to apply a little bit of grease on the outer ring of the pistons here on both. This will help the pads operate quietly and smoothly. And then I'm going to do the same thing to these 3 outer ears here for the same exact reason, because these are the ones that press up against the outer pad while the pistons press up against the inner pad. You don't need a lot. You don't want it to squeeze out and get all over the place. Just a little bit. And one last thing before this caliper gets fully attached, don't forget to put this clip in here, this little spring clip. It sits on these 2 carved out areas of the caliper, and it just helps spread the pads apart. Now take the caliper, Slide it over the pads. Make sure it goes over the slider pins, just like this. Slide in both of your caliper bolts, then we'll torque them to anywhere between 21 and 26 foot-pounds. I'm going to go for 25, just because it's on the higher end. And the same thing applies to these. If you're going to put anything on them, use thread locker, not anti-seize or grease. And there you have it. Now let's transfer over the hose. With my 14mm socket, I'm going to remove the banjo bolt. Fluid's going to come out. Set this aside. I have a collection bucket to catch all the fluid. I'm going to let the caliper drain in here. And while that's doing its thing, I'm going to make sure that I get off these two copper washers here. They're both stuck on the hose, both the inner and the outer one. Sometimes you can get them off like this, but other times you have to pry them off or get them off with pliers. I'm going to try this. There we go. Let's give it a nice loving bonk on both of them. Grab your rag, make sure that there's no debris on this surface here where the new rings are going to sit, or the new washers I should say, which are actually right here. So we're going to have to remove this banjo bolt, leave one of the washers on the bolt, slide the bolt through, and then put another washer on the other side. You want to sandwich the hose in between the two washers. Then we'll go ahead and start this in by hand and then snug it up so that it's nice and tight. All right, that's bottomed out. That's bottomed out. Now with my ratchet, I'm going to go about half a turn. That's going to ensure that I completely crush those copper washers in there, and that's what's going to make a nice tight seal for you. Now I'm going to take some brake parts cleaner and clean this off, because if there is a leak, I want to know, and I don't want to confuse it for residual fluid from doing the job. So if you have any fluid left there, go ahead and clean that off. At this point, I'm going to open up my bleeder screw and let gravity pull the fluid down into the caliper. Sometimes these boots are a little stuck on here. There we go. I'm going to use a 3/8 wrench. A 10mm is a little bit too big and slips off. And I'm going to open up this bleeder screw. And like I said, I'm going to let gravity pull the fluid down. All right, I have a solid and steady trickle of fluid coming out. No air bubbles. That's perfect. I'm going to cap this off, and then I'm going to perform a full manual brake bleed. What that means is I need to have someone in the car pumping up the brake pedal. Now, of course, you want to make sure the master cylinder is full to start. And then after a few pumps, go ahead and open the bleeder screw while pressure is being held on the brake pedal. Once the brake pedal has reached the floor, close this up, let go of the brake pedal and pump it again a few times. Once pressure builds up, hold the brake pedal, open up the bleeder screw, and repeat the process until you have no more air coming out of this bleeder screw. After that, you would cap it off, just like I'm doing now. So I'm assuming that the manual brake bleed has already been done. And then you always want to remember to put this little boot back. It's very important. Otherwise debris gets in there and seizes up your bleeder screw. Let's put the wheel back on. Put on all 5 of your lug nuts and torque them to 150 foot-pounds. That is if you have the 5 lug wheel pattern. If you have 7 lugs, then you want to torque them to 100 foot-pounds. Double check them. There you have it.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.